I rented the cabin for a week. It was deep in the woods, about a 40-minute drive from the nearest town. I wanted time alone, away from everything, work, people, noise. Just me, some books, and a quiet place to clear my head. The drive up was fine, mostly dirt roads lined with thick trees. The cabin itself was small but decent. A single-story place with a wraparound porch, a wood-burning stove, and a little kitchen with old appliances. The owner had left some firewood stacked outside, and there was a creek nearby for water. The first night was uneventful. I cooked a simple meal, read by lantern light, and fell asleep early. The silence out here was thick, almost too much. No cars in the distance, no hum of electricity. Just the wind and the occasional creak of old wood. The second day, I hiked a little, explored the area. The trees were dense, and the ground was uneven, covered in thick roots and dead leaves. I found an old, rusted-out car deep in the woods, the kind from the 70s. The windows were shattered, the seats torn apart by animals. I stood there for a while, wondering how it got there, how long it had been sitting. That night, I heard something outside. Not animals, something heavier. Footsteps, slow and careful. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. It stopped after a few minutes, but I barely slept. The third day, I found tracks. Not deer or bear, but boots. Fresh ones. They circled the cabin. I felt a tightness in my chest. Someone had been here last night, walking around while I slept. I told myself it could have been a hiker passing through, but it felt wrong. Too close, too deliberate. I stayed inside most of the day, keeping the door locked. I listened. Nothing. But the woods felt different now, like they were watching me. I had no cell service, and the old landline in the cabin was dead. I considered leaving early, but the thought of walking to my truck in the dark, through the trees, made my stomach turn. That night, I kept the lantern on. I sat in bed, listening. At some point, I must have dozed off. When I woke up, the lantern was out. I don't remember turning it off. My hands felt cold, my body stiff. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and steady, moving around the cabin. I stayed still, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped at the front door. A long silence. Then the doorknob rattled. A soft, testing movement. My chest tightened. I reached for the hunting knife I kept on the nightstand. The rattling stopped. More silence. Then the footsteps moved away, fading into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. I waited for morning. As soon as the sun rose, I packed my bag, grabbed my keys, and stepped outside. The ground was damp, muddy. There were prints leading from the trees to my door. Clear, deep boot prints. I walked to my truck, trying not to run. My hands shook as I started the engine. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. A figure stood at the tree line, dressed in dark clothes, still as a statue, watching me leave. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. I just drove. I never told anyone the full story. When people ask why I cut my trip short, I just say I wasn't feeling well. But I know what I saw, and I know that if I had stayed one more night, I might not have left at all. I don't know why I agreed to stay at the cabin alone. Maybe it was stubbornness, wanting to prove to myself that I could handle being alone in the middle of nowhere. Maybe I just wanted to get away from everything, work, the noise of the city, people. Either way, I regretted it before the first night was even over. The drive was long, nothing but miles of trees on both sides of the road. The further I went, the less I saw of civilization. No gas stations, no houses, not even a road sign past a certain point. Just trees and silence. My uncle's cabin was deep in the woods, far from any town, tucked away near a lake. He used to hunt here, but he hadn't been back in years. When he mentioned it was still standing and that I was welcome to use it, I thought it sounded like the perfect getaway. The place was old but solid. One story, built from thick logs, with a tin roof that rattled when the wind picked up. Inside, it smelled like wood and dust, like it had been sealed up for a long time. There was a main living area with a fireplace, a kitchen with an old propane stove, and a bedroom in the back. A single bathroom with a rust-stained sink and a shower that barely dripped water. The windows were covered in thick curtains that made the inside feel even darker than it already was. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. I unloaded my bags, checked my phone, and saw that I had no service. Not surprising. My uncle had warned me that the reception out here was non-existent. There was a radio in the cabin, an old thing with a crank on the side. I tested it and it worked, but all I could pick up were crackling, half-dead stations that faded in and out. By the time night fell, I had a fire going in the wood stove, a lantern lit on the kitchen table, and a heavy sense of unease settling in my chest. It was too quiet. In the city, even at night, there's always some kind of noise, cars in the distance, voices, sirens. Out here, there was nothing. Just the occasional creak of the cabin settling and the sound of the wind moving through the trees. I kept telling myself that this was what I wanted, peace and quiet, but my own thoughts were starting to feel too loud. At some point, I heard something outside, a rustling sound, faint, like something moving through the leaves. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer maybe, a raccoon. But then it happened again, closer this time. A slow, deliberate sound, like footsteps. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and shone it through the window. Nothing, just trees and darkness. I tried to shake it off, but I didn't sleep well. Every little sound jolted me awake. The wind against the cabin, the faint creak of the wooden porch, the occasional snap of a branch outside. The worst part was the feeling, like someone was watching me. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake it. The next morning, I walked around the cabin, looking for any sign of what had been outside. The ground was covered in damp leaves, but near the porch, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Footprints, not animal tracks, human. They were deep, pressed into the mud, circling the cabin. Someone had been outside during the night. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe a hiker had wandered too close. Maybe it was just some local hunter checking out the cabin. But that didn't make sense. The footprints weren't just passing through. They circled the entire cabin, stopping by the windows. Someone had been watching me. I spent the rest of the day trying to convince myself I was overreacting. I kept busy, chopping wood, making sure the doors and windows were locked. But as the sun went down, my nerves got worse. I kept checking the windows, jumping at every sound. The forest felt different, like it was pressing in on me. That night, it happened again. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate. This time, I didn't wait. I grabbed my flashlight and my uncle's old hunting rifle that he'd left in the cabin and swung the door open. The beam of my light cut through the darkness, but there was nothing, just trees and silence. But I knew someone was out there. I could feel it. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in the chair by the door, rifle in my lap, waiting, listening. Around 3 a.m, something knocked on the window. Not a tap, not a scrape, 3 solid knocks. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. And then nothing, just silence. At first light, I packed my bags, threw them in the truck, and got the hell out of there. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the trees, watching me. But there was nothing, just the cabin, sitting there like it had been for years, like nothing had happened. I don't know who was out there. I don't want to know. All I know is that I will never go back. I don't know why I agreed to it. Maybe I thought getting out of town for a while would help clear my head. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't the kind of person who got spooked easily. But now, looking back, I know I should have trusted my gut. The cabin was way out there, farther than I expected. The dirt road leading to it was narrow, full of deep ruts and loose gravel, the kind of road that makes you grip the wheel too hard and clench your jaw. The further I drove, the less I saw of anything but trees. Thick, dark trees that seemed to swallow the light. I kept thinking, if I break down out here, I'm screwed. It took me almost half an hour to reach the clearing where the cabin sat. It was small, built from old logs with a roof that sagged just enough to make me uneasy. A deep porch wrapped around the front, its wood gray and splintered. The windows were dark, empty. I killed the engine and sat there for a minute, listening. No birds, no wind in the trees, just silence, thick and heavy. It made my ears ring. The air smelled like damp wood and earth. I grabbed my bag from the passenger seat and climbed out. The cabin door was unlocked, just like the owner said it would be. The inside smelled stale like dust and old wood. It was small, just a main room with a fireplace, a kitchen area, and a bedroom in the back. The furniture was old, covered in scratches. There was a single framed picture on the wall of some mountain range I didn't recognize. I set my bag down on the table and exhaled. 3 days, just 3 days alone. No people, no noise, no stress. That was the plan. The first night was fine. I made a fire, cooked some canned soup, and read until my eyes got heavy. The silence was unnerving, but I told myself I'd get used to it. Sometime in the night, I woke up. No reason, just that feeling, you know the one, like something's off. The fire had burned low, casting strange shadows on the walls. I listened, still no sounds outside, not even crickets. I sat up in bed, every nerve in my body on edge. Then I heard it, a single heavy thud from outside. I held my breath, listened. Nothing, maybe an animal, a branch falling. I told myself anything but what my brain was actually thinking. I lay back down, pulling the covers up even though the room was warm from the fire. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I checked around outside. There was nothing, no footprints, no fallen branches, just the same silent forest pressing in on all sides. I spent the day trying to shake off the unease. I read, took a short hike down to the stream, made lunch. By evening, I was feeling better. The fear from the night before seemed stupid in the daylight. Then, around sunset, I noticed something strange. The woods, which had been silent since I arrived, weren't just quiet. They were empty. I hadn't seen a single bird. No deer, no squirrels, not even insects buzzing around. The longer I thought about it, the worse it got. Woods weren't supposed to be this still. Even in the dead of winter, you'd hear something. I sat on the porch, staring into the trees, trying to convince myself I was overthinking. The sun dipped lower, and that feeling crept in again. That heavy, pressing awareness that I wasn't alone, that I was being watched. I went inside and locked the door, checked the windows, lit a few candles when the fire got low. And then, sometime in the night, I woke up again. First, I didn't know why. Then I heard it. Slow, steady footsteps on the porch. Not heavy, not loud, but deliberate. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The steps paused near the door. I stared at it, my mind racing. There was no lock, nothing but the weak wooden latch. A soft creak of wood. Whoever or whatever was out there had shifted their weight. I reached slowly for the fire poker near the hearth, gripping it tight. The footsteps moved again, this time away from the door, toward the window. I stayed as still as I could. The candle on the table flickered, casting long shadows. Then the footsteps stopped. I forced myself to breathe slow and quiet, my fingers aching from how hard I was gripping the poker. Minutes passed. Nothing. After what felt like an hour, I finally convinced myself to move. I crept toward the window, keeping to the edges of the room where the floorboards were less likely to creak. I leaned forward, just enough to see outside. Nothing, just darkness. I stood there for a long time, listening, waiting. Then I forced myself to go back to bed, still gripping the poker. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I checked the porch. The dirt was scuffed like something or someone had been standing there for a while, but no prints, no clear tracks. That was it. I packed my bag, threw it in the truck, and left without looking back. I never told anyone what happened. I don't know what was out there, but I know this: when the woods go silent, when you feel that deep, crawling unease in your gut, you don't ignore it. You leave. I took the trip to the cabin because I needed to clear my head. Life in the city had been running me down, and I figured some time alone in the woods would help me reset. The place belonged to an old friend, someone I hadn't talked to in years, but he had no problem letting me borrow it for a few weeks. He gave me the key, told me there was no Wi-Fi, and wished me luck. The drive out there took longer than I expected. The roads twisted through dense forests, and after a while, I stopped seeing houses. The deeper I went, the more it felt like I was leaving everything behind. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, the sun was setting, and the place looked exactly how I pictured it. Old, wooden, simple. There was a small porch with a single rocking chair, a stack of firewood beside the door, and nothing but trees in every direction. Inside, it was just as basic. One main room with a fireplace, a tiny kitchen, and a bedroom in the back. Smelled like dust and wood. The furniture was old but solid, like it had been there for decades. The only light came from a couple of bare bulbs powered by a small generator out back, which I had to refill with gas every couple of days. There was no cell service, just me, the trees, and the sounds of the forest. The first couple of days were peaceful. I spent my time chopping wood, hiking, and reading. At night, I sat by the fire and let my mind wander. The quiet was a little unsettling at first, but I got used to it. I even started enjoying the isolation. Then, on the third night, I woke up to a sound outside. It wasn't loud, just a soft rustling, but it was enough to jolt me awake. At first, I thought it was an animal. Deer were common in these parts, and raccoons weren't shy about sniffing around for food. But as I lay there listening, something felt off. The sound wasn't random. It was slow, deliberate. I grabbed the flashlight by my bed and got up. The cabin door was locked, and the windows were shut. Still, I had the uneasy feeling that someone or something was out there. I turned off the flashlight and stood by the window, staring into the darkness. Nothing moved, just trees swaying in the wind. After a few minutes, I convinced myself I was overreacting and went back to bed. The next day, I found tracks in the dirt around the cabin. At first, I thought they were boot prints, but they were strange, wider than a normal shoe with an odd shape that I couldn't quite place. I followed them for a bit, but they disappeared into the underbrush. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I started feeling like I wasn't alone out here. That night, the noises came back. This time, they were closer. Footsteps, slow and steady, circling the cabin. I sat up in bed, barely breathing. I wanted to believe it was an animal, but deep down, I knew better. The way the steps moved, the way they stopped and started, it felt like someone was watching, waiting. I didn't sleep much after that. Every little noise put me on edge. I started keeping the axe by my bed, just in case. During the day, I searched the woods, looking for any sign of who or what was out there. I found nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, no sign that anyone had been nearby. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. On the sixth night, things escalated. I had just gotten into bed when I heard something heavy hit the side of the cabin. Not a small knock, but a deep, solid thud. My heart pounded. I grabbed the flashlight and the axe and crept toward the window. I shined the light outside, but all I saw were trees and shadows. Then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw it. A shape standing at the edge of the woods. Too far to make out details, but close enough to see that it wasn't an animal. It was tall, broad-shouldered, completely still. The flashlight flickered, and when I steadied it, the figure was gone. Just the trees again. My hands were shaking as I backed away from the window. I barely slept that night. I kept the axe close, listening for any movement. But everything stayed silent. Too silent. At dawn, I made a decision. I wasn't staying another night. I packed my things, grabbed my keys, and headed outside. The morning light made everything feel a little less threatening, but my nerves were shot. As I loaded my bag into the car, I took one last look at the cabin. That's when I saw them. Not just one set of tracks, dozens, surrounding the cabin, leading into the woods. Some were deep, like whoever made them had been standing there for hours. Others were fresh, leading away from the porch. I didn't waste another second. I jumped into the car and tore down the dirt road, my heart pounding the whole way back to town. I never told my friend what happened. I never went back. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder how long they had been watching, and what would have happened if I had stayed just one more night. I don't know how long I was out there before I realized I had made a mistake. The kind of mistake that you feel deep in your gut, twisting and pulling, telling you that you shouldn't have come. But it was too late to turn back. I had rented the cabin online, lured in by pictures of a quiet retreat deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. The listing promised solitude, a place to think, to disconnect. That was what I wanted. Just a week to myself. No people, no distractions, just me and nature. The drive was long, winding, and empty. The last stretch was a dirt road barely wide enough for my truck, the kind of road that hadn't been maintained in years. By the time I arrived, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows over the trees. The cabin looked older than in the pictures. The wood was dark, worn down by time and weather. The front porch sagged slightly in the middle. The windows were streaked with dirt, and the door creaked loudly when I pushed it open. Inside was small, just one main room with a kitchenette and a fireplace, a single bedroom, and a bathroom with a rust-stained sink. The air smelled stale, like dust and old wood, but I didn't care. I was here to be alone, and it served its purpose. That first night was uneventful. I made a simple dinner, read for a while by the dim light of an old lamp, and listened to the sounds of the forest. I fell asleep easily, exhausted from the drive. But sometime in the night, I woke up. It was dead silent, too silent. I had grown up in the country. I knew what the woods sounded like at night. Crickets, rustling leaves, distant howls. But now there was nothing, just a thick, heavy silence pressing against my ears. I held my breath and listened. Then, just outside, I heard it. A soft scrape against the porch. Slow, deliberate. I told myself it was an animal. A raccoon, maybe, or a fox. I reached for my flashlight and pointed it through the window, but I saw nothing. Still, the uneasy feeling stuck with me, and I had trouble falling back asleep. The next morning, I found something strange near the porch steps. Footprints. Not boots, not shoes. Bare feet. And they weren't small. They were large, wider than my own. The toes slightly splayed out like someone who had spent a lifetime walking without shoes. I stared at them for a long time, my stomach tight. No one should be out here. The nearest house was miles away. I checked my truck, making sure it was still locked, then walked the perimeter of the cabin, scanning the trees. Nothing, just the endless forest stretching in every direction. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe someone had been camping nearby. Maybe it was old. I forced myself to shake it off and went about my day. But that night, I heard it again. The same slow scraping against the porch. I didn't move this time. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting. Then something new, a tap on the window. Just one. Sharp, purposeful. My stomach turned to ice. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stared at the dark ceiling, my pulse pounding in my ears. Minutes passed. Then another tap, and then nothing. The silence stretched on, long and suffocating. The next morning, I checked around the cabin again. The footprints were back. This time, they led from the trees to the window. My window, and they were fresh. I had enough. I packed my bag, threw it in the truck, and tried to start the engine. It wouldn't turn over. I cursed, tried again. Nothing. It wasn't the battery, the lights worked fine. It had gas. It should have started, but it didn't. A pit formed in my stomach. I was stuck. I had no cell service, no landline, nothing. I would have to walk to town, and it was at least 15 miles away. I didn't want to wait for nightfall. I packed what I could into my backpack, took my flashlight and my hunting knife, and started walking. The forest was thick, the path barely visible. I kept checking behind me, feeling like I was being watched. The further I got from the cabin, the more I wanted to turn back. Something about it felt wrong, like I was walking straight into something worse. But I kept going. I walked for hours. The sun started to dip lower, and I still hadn't reached the main road. Then I saw it. Footprints, bare, wide, deep in the dirt. and they weren't going toward the cabin. They were coming from it. Panic hit me hard. I spun around, scanning the trees, feeling the world closing in. The footprints were fresh. Someone was out here. Someone had been following me. I picked up my pace, nearly running now, heart hammering. Then I saw something ahead, half buried in the dirt. Something metal. My keys. I stared at them, my mind racing. They had been in my backpack. I was sure of it. I hadn't dropped them. A rustling sound came from the trees behind me. Slow, deliberate. I grabbed the keys and ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. The whole way back to the cabin, I could hear movement behind me. Twigs snapping, leaves crunching. I burst out of the trees, sprinted to the truck, jammed the key into the ignition, and turned it. The engine roared to life. I slammed it into reverse, tires spinning, and tore out of there so fast I nearly lost control. I didn't slow down. Not until I hit the main road. Not until I saw the first lights of town. I never went back for my things. I never checked the listing again. I just left. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone, I still hear it. That soft, deliberate tap on the window. The road leading up to the cabin was rough, the kind of road that rattles your bones even when you're driving slow. Gravel crunched under my tires as I eased the truck forward, my hands gripping the wheel tighter than they needed to. The cabin was buried deep in the woods, farther than I expected, but I had paid for solitude, and that was exactly what I got. I rented the place for a week. A break, that's what I called it. Work had been grinding me down, and I told myself that a week in the woods, away from people, away from the noise of everyday life, would do me good. No phone calls, no emails, no distractions. Just me, the trees, and my thoughts. The cabin itself was nothing fancy. One story, dark wood, a porch with a single rocking chair. It looked older than I thought it would, the kind of place that had seen years of storms and rough winters. I killed the engine, grabbed my bag from the passenger seat, and stepped out. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. It was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no wind moving through the trees. Just stillness. Inside, the place smelled like dust and old wood. There was a small kitchen, a living area with a fireplace, and one bedroom in the back. A single window looked out onto the trees, which seemed too close, like they had been creeping in over the years, inch by inch. The bed was made, the sheets stiff and cold when I ran my hand over them. I dropped my bag and took a deep breath. This was fine. This was what I needed. The first night was uneventful. I sat on the porch, listened to the nothingness, and let my mind settle. I cooked a simple meal, read a book by the dim light of the lantern, and went to bed early. The mattress was uncomfortable, the kind that made my back ache, but I was exhausted enough that I fell asleep quickly. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. I lay still, listening. It wasn't the rustling of an animal or the creak of trees shifting in the wind. It was deliberate. Slow, heavy footsteps on the gravel just outside the cabin. I held my breath. My heart pounded in my ears. The footsteps stopped near the porch, then silence. I strained to hear anything else, but there was nothing. After a few minutes, I convinced myself I was imagining things, that my brain was still half dreaming. Eventually, I fell back asleep. Morning came, and the uneasiness lingered. I stepped outside, my boots crunching against the gravel. Nothing looked disturbed. No footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. Just my truck, the trees, and the empty space around me. I shook off the feeling and went about my day. Hiked a little, took some pictures, tried to enjoy the quiet. That night, it happened again. This time, I was awake when I heard it. The same slow, heavy footsteps, moving just beyond the cabin walls. I sat up in bed, every muscle in my body tense. My breath came in shallow, quiet gasps. I waited. The footsteps stopped outside the bedroom window. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. No knock. No scratching at the walls. Just silence. Then, the footsteps moved again, retreating into the woods. I sat in bed until the sun began to rise, my body refusing to relax. I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe or a bear, something moving through the trees that just happened to pass by my cabin. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The third night, I was ready. I sat in the dark with a knife in my lap, waiting. The footsteps came just like before, slow, steady. I held my breath, my fingers tightening around the handle of the knife. The footsteps stopped outside the front door this time. My heart slammed against my ribs. Then the doorknob rattled, not violently, just a slow, deliberate testing of the lock. I felt my stomach drop. My mouth went dry. My truck keys were on the counter in the kitchen, too far away to grab quickly. My phone had no signal. I was completely alone. The doorknob stopped moving, but the silence was worse. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away, back into the trees. Morning came and I was done. I threw my things into my bag, grabbed my keys and stepped outside, scanning the area. Nothing. No footprints, no signs of disturbance. Just the same quiet woods and the overwhelming sense that I was not welcome here. I got into my truck and started the engine. The cabin disappeared in my rearview mirror as I sped down the gravel road, my hands gripping the wheel like a lifeline. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I never found out who or what was outside my cabin those nights. I didn't report it. I didn't tell anyone. Some things I think are better left alone. All I know is that I will never go back to those woods again. I don't even know where to start. I don't know how to explain it in a way that makes sense, but I'm gonna try. Maybe writing it down will help me figure it out, or at least help me understand what the hell happened. It started when I decided to get away for a few days. Just me, alone, in a small cabin up in northern Minnesota. I'd been feeling burnt out. Work was draining, life felt repetitive, and I needed space to breathe. I found a listing for an off-grid cabin near a lake, completely isolated, surrounded by thick woods. It seemed perfect. I packed light, some food, a couple of books, my phone, though I knew there wouldn't be service, and a flashlight. The listing mentioned the cabin had no electricity or running water, just a wood stove for heat, a hand pump well outside, and an outhouse. I figured I could handle it for a few days. I wanted to disconnect, to be away from everything. The drive up was long, winding through miles of forest roads, the trees growing denser the further I went. By the time I reached the turnoff for the cabin, I hadn't seen another car in nearly an hour. The road leading to the cabin was narrow, barely more than a dirt path, lined with towering pines. My car's tires crunched over the gravel as I made my way deeper into the woods. When I finally saw the cabin, I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. It was exactly as described, small, old, with a weathered wooden exterior. The lake was visible through the trees, still and dark, reflecting the overcast sky. The air smelled like damp earth and pine needles. It should have been peaceful, but something about it felt off. Maybe it was just the silence. It was so quiet out there, so completely devoid of human noise, that it almost felt unnatural. I shook it off and went inside. The cabin was simple. A single room with a cot, a wood stove, a small table, and a few shelves. There was an old rocking chair in the corner and a pile of chopped wood stacked neatly against one wall. The only light came from the windows, which were covered in grime, letting in a dull, muted glow. I set my bag down and started getting settled. First, I checked the hand pump outside. After a few stiff pulls, water sputtered out, cold and metallic tasting. It would do. Then I checked the outhouse. It was about 50 feet from the cabin, a little wooden shack with a door that barely latched. Inside, it smelled like damp wood and something else, something faintly sour. I told myself it was just the natural odor of an old outhouse and hurried out of there. By the time I got a fire going in the stove, the sky had started to darken. I ate a simple meal, read for a while by flashlight, then decided to call it a night. The cot was uncomfortable, but I was tired enough that I didn't care. I turned off my flashlight, let the fire's glow flicker against the walls, and closed my eyes. I don't know how long I slept before I woke up. It was pitch black, the fire burned down to embers, and the air was freezing. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. Then I heard it, a sound just outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was an animal, a scratching noise, slow and deliberate, moving along the exterior wall. I held my breath, listening. Then it stopped. The silence stretched, my heartbeat loud in my ears. I reached for my flashlight and turned it on, sweeping the beam across the small cabin. Nothing, just the empty room, the dim glow of cooling embers in the stove. Then, a creak. The porch. Someone or something was on the porch. I stayed absolutely still, barely breathing. The door had a simple latch, nothing that would keep out someone determined to get in. I waited, listening, but after what felt like an eternity, the sound stopped. No more creaking, no more scratching, just silence. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I kept the flashlight clutched in my hand, my back pressed against the wall, staring at the door until the first gray light of dawn seeped through the grimy windows. As soon as it was light enough to see, I went outside. The air was still and cold. The trees stood tall and unmoving. I checked the porch. There were no footprints, no signs that anything had been there at all. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was just the wind or the old wood settling. That's what I told myself. I almost believed it. But then I found the marks on the side of the cabin. Long, deep scratches running parallel down the wood. Not claw marks, not animal. They were too precise, too deliberate. Like something or someone had dragged a sharp object along the surface over and over again. I stared at them for a long time, my breath fogging in the cold morning air. Then I turned and looked at the woods. The trees stood silent, thick and dark, stretching endlessly in every direction. I suddenly felt very, very alone. I should have left right then. I should have packed my things, gotten in my car and driven away, but I didn't. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overreacting. I forced myself to stick to my plan. That night, I locked the door, kept the fire burning high, and stayed awake as long as I could. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, making the cabin creak and groan. I told myself that was all it was, until I heard it again. The same slow, deliberate scratching, moving along the wall, closer this time. I didn't move, I didn't breathe, and then the latch moved, not from the wind, not from settling wood. Something was trying to lift it. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, pointing it at the door. The sound stopped immediately. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, my hands shaking, my ears straining for any sound, but nothing else happened. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have drifted off. When I woke up, it was morning. The latch was still in place, but when I stepped outside, I saw them. Footprints, human footprints circling the cabin. I left. I grabbed my bag, ran to my car, and didn't look back. I drove until I had service, then called the owner of the cabin to tell them what happened. They were quiet for a long time. Then they just said, "I'll check it out." That was it. I don't know who or what was out there. I don't want to know. But I know one thing for sure. I will never go back. I don't know why I agreed to it. Maybe it was the stress. Maybe it was just the idea of getting away for a few days, far from the city, far from work, far from anything. My brother had been the one to suggest it. He said his friend had a cabin out in the woods, deep enough that cell service was spotty, but not too far from a small town if I needed anything. I was hesitant at first. I liked the outdoors well enough, but something about staying alone in an unfamiliar place never sat well with me. But I went anyway. The drive was long, almost 4 hours, most of it through back roads lined with trees that only got denser the farther I went. I passed through the small town my brother had mentioned. A few gas stations, a grocery store, a diner with a faded sign that just said EATS in red letters. That was about it. After that, it was another 30 minutes on a dirt road, the trees closing in so tight on either side that I had to turn on my headlights long before the sun actually set. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, I felt an odd mix of relief and unease. It was just as my brother described. Small but well kept, a deep brown color with a covered porch and a chimney sticking out from the roof. The woods surrounded it entirely, no other buildings in sight. The nearest neighbor was apparently miles away. I killed the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the quiet. No cars, no voices, just the wind moving through the trees and the occasional creak of wood settling in the cool evening air. I grabbed my bag, locked the car, and made my way to the door. The key had been left under a loose board on the porch, just as my brother's friend had said. I found it easily and let myself in. Inside, the cabin was warm and smelled faintly of wood smoke and something earthy, like old pine. The furniture was simple: wooden chairs, a couch with a faded plaid blanket draped over it, a small kitchen with a stove and a fridge that hummed softly in the quiet. A single hallway led to the bedroom and bathroom. Everything was in order, nothing out of place. I should have felt at ease. Instead, there was a tightness in my chest, a feeling I couldn't shake, like the air was too still, too thick. But I ignored it. I told myself it was just the newness of it all. I wasn't used to being this isolated. I wasn't used to the silence. The first night was uneventful. I made myself a simple dinner, sat on the porch for a while, and watched the trees sway in the wind. The stars were bright, brighter than I'd ever seen them, unspoiled by city lights. I went to bed early, the fatigue of the drive finally hitting me. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. At first, I didn't know why. The cabin was dark, save for the moonlight spilling in through the window. The wind had died down, and the only sound was the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Then I heard it, a faint crunching sound, like footsteps on gravel. I held my breath, listening. It was slow, deliberate, not an animal. I knew what animals sounded like in the woods. This was different. The steps stopped just outside the cabin, near the porch. Then silence. I didn't move. I strained my ears, waiting, but nothing followed. Just the heavy quiet pressing in from all sides. Eventually, I must have convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe a branch had fallen. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I forced myself to relax, turning onto my side, and eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I went outside to check. The ground was damp from the night's dew, and there, clear as day, were footprints in the dirt. Not mine. Not boot prints like mine had been. Bare feet, leading from the tree line to the porch, and stopping there. No returning prints. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. My skin felt cold, even though the sun was already warming the air. I tried to come up with an explanation, but nothing made sense. If someone had walked up to the cabin barefoot in the middle of the night, where had they gone? I checked around the cabin, half expecting to find something else. A sign, a clue, anything. But there was nothing. Just those prints leading up to the porch and stopping dead. I told myself it was kids, maybe some locals messing with me, knowing an outsider was staying here. That had to be it. I shook it off and went about my day, trying to ignore the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. That night, I locked the door. I checked it twice. I even pushed a chair against it, just in case. But I still woke up in the middle of the night. And this time, the sound wasn't outside. It was inside. A slow, dragging sound. Bare feet moving across wooden floors. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The sound came from the living room, just beyond my door. Then it stopped. Silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. I lay there, every muscle in my body locked, waiting for something, anything. But nothing came. I don't know how long I stayed like that, listening. It felt like hours. Finally, when my body couldn't take it anymore, I reached for my phone, fingers shaking. No service. I needed to get out. Slowly, carefully, I slid out of bed. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might give me away. I crept toward the door, listening. Still nothing. I eased it open just a crack, peering into the darkness. The living room was empty. The front door was still locked. The chair was still in place. But the floor, the wooden planks, had faint, smeared prints leading from the hallway to the center of the room. I didn't wait to find out more. I grabbed my keys, my bag, and left. I didn't bother packing. I didn't turn off the lights. I just got in my car, started the engine, and drove. I didn't stop until I reached the town. I pulled into the gas station, parked under the bright, fluorescent lights, and just sat there, my hands shaking. I called my brother, told him to let his friend know I'd left, that I wasn't going back. I never got an answer for what happened in that cabin. I don't think I want one. All I know is that I left and I never should have gone there in the first place. The road leading to the cabin was nothing more than a narrow dirt path, winding through the dense forest. My truck's headlights cut through the thick darkness, illuminating only a few feet ahead before the trees swallowed the light. The drive had been longer than expected, the last 2 hours spent navigating rough, uneven ground. No cell service, no radio stations coming through the static. Just the sound of my tires crunching over the gravel and the occasional rustling of branches when the wind picked up. I had booked the cabin months ago, needing a break from the noise of the city. It was an old hunting lodge, tucked deep in the woods, promising solitude and peace. The owner assured me it had everything I needed: a working stove, a fireplace, running water from a well, and a generator for power. That last part made me uneasy. If something happened to the generator, I'd be stuck in complete darkness, miles away from the nearest road. But I had come prepared: extra batteries, a satellite phone, and plenty of food and water. When I finally reached the clearing, I could barely make out the shape of the cabin against the tree line. It was smaller than I expected, just a single story with a steeply pitched roof and a covered porch. The wooden walls were dark with age, the windows barely reflecting the light from my truck. A single rocking chair sat on the porch, facing the woods, as if someone had just been sitting there moments ago. I turned off the engine and climbed out, stretching my legs. The silence was immediate. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, not even the chirping of crickets. Just the wind whispering through the trees. I grabbed my bags from the truck bed, making my way up the short set of steps to the door. The key was in the lock, just as the owner had promised. It turned smoothly, and the door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit interior. The cabin smelled of dust and old wood, mixed with the faintest hint of something damp. The living area was simple: a worn-out couch, a wooden coffee table, and a brick fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The small kitchen was to my right, with an old gas stove and a fridge that I knew would only work if the generator was on. A single hallway led to the bedroom and bathroom. I flicked on the light switch, relieved when the bulbs flickered to life. The generator was working for now. After unloading my supplies, I went outside to turn on the porch light. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. There were footprints in the dirt. They led from the porch steps into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. I stared at them for a long moment. They weren't fresh, but they also weren't old enough to have been washed away by rain or wind. Someone had been here recently. I tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. Maybe the owner had been checking on the place before I arrived. Maybe it was just a hiker passing through. Still, I locked the door behind me when I went back inside. The first night was uneventful. I made a quick dinner, read by lantern light, and turned in early. The mattress was stiff, and the blankets smelled musty, but I was exhausted. I fell asleep almost immediately. I woke up around 3 a.m., my mouth dry, my heart pounding for no reason I could understand. It was dead silent, not just quiet, the kind of silence that made my ears ring. I reached for my water bottle, taking a few slow sips, listening. The wind had stopped. No creaking branches, no rustling leaves. Just nothing. Then I heard it. A soft scraping sound coming from the front porch. I froze, my grip tightening around the bottle. It was slow, deliberate, like someone dragging something across the wooden planks. I strained to hear more, but the sound stopped. I waited, my body tense, but nothing else happened. Minutes passed, then an hour, and eventually, I drifted back into an uneasy sleep. In the morning, I stepped outside to check the porch. Nothing was out of place, but the footprints were still there, clearer now in the daylight. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I told myself I was being paranoid, that isolation was getting to me, but I couldn't ignore the knot in my stomach. That day, I went for a hike, trying to clear my head. The woods were beautiful in the daylight, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Every so often, I'd stop and listen, convinced I heard footsteps behind me. When I turned, there was nothing but trees. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sky was starting to darken. I started a fire in the fireplace, wanting the warmth and the light. The heat made the space feel less empty, less exposed. I ate my dinner by the fire, then sat in the rocking chair with a book. The night stretched on, the fire crackling softly. Then, just past midnight, the generator cut out. The lights went off. The fridge stopped humming. The only sound was the soft popping of embers in the fireplace. I grabbed my flashlight, moving carefully through the dark. The air inside the cabin suddenly felt too still, like something was waiting. I had to go outside to reset the generator. I hesitated at the door, then forced myself to step out onto the porch. The cold night air hit me immediately. The trees swayed in the wind, their branches shifting shadows across the ground. I moved quickly to the generator shed, my flashlight beam cutting through the dark. As I reached for the latch, I heard it again, the scraping sound, but this time it was coming from behind me. I turned, my breath catching in my throat. The porch was empty. My truck was parked exactly where I left it, but something wasn't right. The rocking chair was moving, just slightly, like someone had just stood up from it. My skin crawled. I didn't hear anything approach. No footsteps, no rustling in the leaves, just that sound, that slow, deliberate dragging across wood. I reset the generator with shaking hands, the hum of power returning. The porch light flickered on, casting long shadows over the clearing. I forced myself to walk back inside, locking the door behind me. That night, I barely slept. I lay awake, listening to every creak, every shift in the wind. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I packed my bags. I didn't care that I had planned to stay for a week. Something was wrong with that place, something unseen. As I threw my things into the truck bed, I glanced back at the porch one last time. The rocking chair was still moving. I didn't look back again. I never wanted to spend the weekend at the cabin, but I had no choice. My older brother, Mark, had begged me to join him for a hunting trip, and after weeks of nagging, I gave in. He had already reserved a small rental cabin deep in the woods, far from any town. "It'll be good for you," he said. "You need to get out of the house." The drive took longer than I expected. The gravel road was narrow and uneven, winding through dense trees that blocked most of the sky. I followed Mark's truck, my old sedan struggling over the rough terrain. The deeper we drove, the less I liked it. My phone lost signal about 30 minutes in, and by the time we reached the cabin, I felt completely cut off from the world. The cabin was smaller than I imagined. A single-story structure made of dark, weathered wood with a sagging roof and a narrow porch. It had one door and two small windows, both covered in thick curtains. A metal chimney poked out from the roof, but no smoke came from it. A wooden shed sat a few yards away, partially hidden behind the trees. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and dust. The furniture was sparse: a rickety table with two chairs, an old couch with torn fabric, and a small wood stove in the corner. The bedroom had two twin beds with thin mattresses, covered in old plaid blankets. The bathroom was little more than a closet with a toilet and a sink, and the shower barely worked. The only light came from a single battery-powered lantern, since the cabin had no electricity. Mark was excited, but I felt uneasy. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. Mark didn't seem to notice. He unloaded his gear, talking about all the deer tracks he had seen on the way in. I forced a nod, pretending to care. We spent the first evening scouting the area. The woods stretched for miles in every direction, thick with trees and underbrush. We found a small clearing about a 10-minute walk from the cabin, where Mark planned to set up in the morning. The sun set quickly, and by the time we got back, it was almost dark. After a quick meal of canned soup, we settled in. Mark fell asleep instantly, but I lay awake, listening. The silence outside felt unnatural. No wind, no crickets, just nothing. My stomach twisted with unease. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke suddenly to a sound. A faint rustling outside the cabin. My heart pounded. It was soft but steady, like someone moving through the brush. I sat up, straining to hear. Then it stopped. I held my breath, waiting. After what felt like forever, I convinced myself it was just an animal and forced myself to lie back down. Morning came, and Mark was already up, excited to head out. I didn't mention the noise. I didn't want him to think I was being paranoid. We spent most of the day in the woods, barely speaking. Mark was focused on hunting while I just wanted to get through the trip. When we got back, we found the door slightly open. Mark laughed it off, saying I must not have shut it all the way. I knew I had, but I didn't argue. We checked inside, but nothing seemed missing. Just a few small things out of place. The lantern wasn't where I left it, and my backpack had been unzipped. Mark said I was imagining things. That night, I couldn't sleep. The cabin felt wrong, like someone had been inside while we were gone. The blankets felt scratchy, the air heavy. I kept the lantern on just in case. Around midnight, I heard it again, the rustling outside. But this time it was closer. I held my breath, listening. Then a new sound. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching the gravel near the shed. My chest tightened. I glanced at Mark, but he was out cold. I didn't know what to do. If I woke him and it turned out to be nothing, he'd never let me live it down. But if it was something, the footsteps stopped. Silence. I waited, barely breathing. Then a faint creak. The porch. Someone was on the porch. I grabbed the hunting knife from my bag, gripping it tight. The door had no lock, just an old latch that wouldn't hold against any real force. I stared at it, my pulse hammering in my ears. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. No more sounds. No movement. I waited, muscles tense, until exhaustion finally won. I don't remember falling asleep, but I woke to daylight streaming through the curtains. The door was still shut. Mark was already outside, acting like nothing happened. I didn't tell him. The next day, we planned to leave. Mark was frustrated that we hadn't caught anything, and I was eager to go. We packed up, loading the truck. I went inside for one last check and froze. The lantern, it was on the floor, tipped over. I knew I hadn't left it like that. My gut clenched. Someone had been inside. I rushed outside, ready to tell Mark, but he was gone. His truck was still there, but no sign of him. I called out, my voice shaky. No response. Panic set in. I ran toward the woods, shouting his name. My breath came fast and shallow. Then, in the distance, movement. A figure half hidden in the trees. I ran toward it, heart in my throat. As I got closer, my stomach dropped. It wasn't Mark. A man stood just inside the tree line, watching me. He was tall, thin, with a dirty jacket and wild hair. His face was shadowed, but I could see his eyes, dark and empty. He didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. I stepped back. He took a slow step forward. I bolted for the cabin, slamming the door behind me. My hands shook as I grabbed my knife. My mind raced. Who was he? How long had he been out there? Had he been the one outside the cabin at night? A sound outside. Footsteps, slow, circling the cabin. Then a voice, low, raspy. I know you're in there. My stomach turned to ice. I held my breath, gripping the knife so hard my fingers ached. A loud bang against the door. Then another. The latch wouldn't hold. I scanned the room, looking for anything to block it, but there was nothing. Another bang. The wood splintered. Then gunfire. A single, deafening shot. Then another. Silence. I didn't move. My ears rang. Then Mark's voice. Hey, you okay? I scrambled to the door, wrenching it open. Mark stood there, rifle in hand, eyes wide. The man was gone. No sign of him, no blood, just the empty woods. Mark didn't ask questions. We grabbed our gear, threw it in the truck, and left. We never talked about it, never went back. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I know one thing: he wasn't just passing through. I never wanted to stay in that cabin. It wasn't my first choice or even my second, but it was the only option I had when everything else fell through. A friend of a friend owned it, said it was old but sturdy, deep in the woods, perfect for a quiet getaway. I didn't need a vacation, I needed space. Space away from the stress, away from the city, away from the noise. The cabin seemed like a last resort, but at least it was something. The road to the place was narrow, barely more than a dirt trail winding through the trees. I had to drive slow to avoid the deep potholes, my car rattling every time I hit one I couldn't dodge. It was late afternoon when I finally arrived. The trees pressed in thick around the clearing, their branches heavy and dark. The cabin stood there, hunched and silent, like it had been waiting for someone to fill its emptiness. It wasn't much to look at. Weathered wood, a sagging porch, a single window staring blankly out over the clearing. The front door creaked when I pushed it open. Inside, it smelled like dust and damp wood, like something long forgotten. The furniture was basic: a worn couch, a small table, an old stove in the kitchen that looked like it hadn't been used in years. There was a bedroom in the back with a thin mattress on a wooden frame, a single window facing the trees. No curtains. I set my bags down and took a deep breath. It was fine. It wasn't comfortable, but I hadn't come here for comfort. I just needed to be alone for a while. The first night, the silence felt heavy. I wasn't used to it. The city had always been a constant hum of life. But here, there was nothing. No cars, no voices, just the wind through the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin settling in the cold. I slept lightly, waking at every unfamiliar sound, my mind turning shadows into shapes, wind into whispers. The second day, I went for a walk. The forest was dense, the ground uneven beneath my boots. The deeper I went, the more I felt like I was being watched. I kept turning, expecting to see something behind me, but there was nothing, just trees. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that I wasn't used to being alone like this. By the time I made it back to the cabin, the sun was starting to set. I locked the door behind me, telling myself I wasn't being paranoid. But that night, I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. It was slow, deliberate, not the wind, not an animal. I stayed still, listening. The sound circled the cabin, footsteps crunching over dead leaves. My breath felt too loud, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. Then silence. I didn't move for what felt like hours. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a deer, maybe a raccoon. But I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. Human, not mine. They led from the tree line, circled the cabin, then disappeared back into the woods. I tried to tell myself it could have been anyone. Maybe some hunter, maybe just someone passing through. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was, they had been watching me. That night, I kept a fire going in the old stove. The light helped, but it didn't stop the sounds. Footsteps again, slower this time, like whoever it was knew I was listening. I sat up in bed, clutching the knife I had brought with me, heart pounding. The footsteps stopped at the front door, then a light knock, 3 times. I didn't move, I barely breathed. The door didn't open, no voice called out, just the knocking, patient and deliberate. Then silence. I stayed awake until the sky started to lighten. When I finally dared to move, I checked the door. Still locked, but there were fresh footprints on the porch. I packed my things in record time. I didn't care if I was being irrational. I didn't care if I was running from something that wasn't even there. I got in my car, started the engine, and didn't look back as I drove away. I never told the friend who lent me the cabin what happened. I never asked who else might have known about that place. I just knew I wouldn't be going back. Some places aren't meant to be lived in. Some places aren't meant to be found. I don't know why I agreed to stay in that cabin. Maybe it was the stress, the exhaustion, or just the need to get away from everything. I had been working nonstop, barely sleeping, barely eating, just existing between deadlines. My friend Mark told me about this place. Secluded, quiet, right in the middle of nowhere. No cell service, no distractions, he had said. You'll finally get some real rest. The drive there was long, longer than I expected. The road narrowed the farther I went, the pavement turning to gravel, then to dirt. My GPS lost signal an hour before I arrived. By then, it was just me and the road, surrounded by thick trees on either side, the sun barely piercing through the canopy. I hadn't seen another car for miles. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, I felt uneasy. It was small, just one story with a slanted roof, the wood dark and worn. It looked abandoned, but Mark had assured me it was maintained by some old guy who lived nearby. There was no other sign of life, no other cabins, no cars, no lights, just the trees and the silence. I grabbed my bag and stepped onto the porch. The wood creaked beneath my weight. The front door was unlocked, just as Mark had said it would be. Inside, it was simple. One main room with a couch, a small kitchen, and a single bedroom with a bed that looked like it hadn't been slept in for years. There was dust on the nightstand, but the rest of the place was clean enough. There was no electricity, only an old gas lamp and a fireplace. I set my bag down, took a deep breath, and told myself this was what I needed, just peace and quiet. The first few hours were uneventful. I made a fire, read a little, ate the sandwich I had packed. I kept telling myself to relax, but something about the cabin felt off. I chalked it up to being alone in an unfamiliar place. I wasn't used to true silence. Even in my apartment, there was always the hum of the fridge, the distant sounds of traffic. Here, there was nothing. When night fell, the temperature dropped fast. The fire flickered, the only light in the cabin. I sat on the couch, listening to the sounds outside, the occasional rustling of leaves, maybe an animal moving through the woods. I told myself it was normal, that I was just being paranoid. Then I heard something different. A single, sharp knock. Not on the front door, on the wall, the back wall of the cabin. I froze. I told myself it was the wind, a branch falling, anything but what it sounded like. I waited, holding my breath. Another knock, louder, closer. I stood up, my heart hammering in my chest. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and pointed it toward the back of the cabin. Nothing, just the wooden wall, the old window with its warped glass. I told myself it had to be an animal. Maybe something had brushed against the cabin. Maybe a bird hit the window. Then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving along the side of the cabin, toward the front door. I turned off the flashlight, my hands shaking. The footsteps stopped. The only sound was the crackling of the fire. I waited, staring at the door, expecting it to swing open. But nothing happened. I stood there for what felt like hours, listening. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. I had been alone all day, my mind playing tricks on me. I forced myself to go to bed, leaving the fire burning low. I didn't sleep well. Every sound made me jump. At some point, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. I woke up suddenly, my body covered in sweat. The fire had died. The cabin was pitch black. Then I heard breathing. Not mine. It was close, just outside the window. Slow, steady. Someone or something standing there just beyond the glass. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I lay there, heart pounding, waiting for whatever it was to go away. Didn't. It just stood there, breathing, waiting. Minutes passed, then an hour. I stayed frozen in bed, my body rigid. At some point, the breathing stopped, but I didn't move. I waited until the first hint of sunlight before I dared to get up. I looked out the window. Nothing. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. But I knew what I heard. I packed my things. I didn't care that I was supposed to stay another night. I was leaving. I stepped outside, and that's when I saw it. On the back wall of the cabin, right where I had heard the knocking, were deep, jagged scratches. Not from an animal, not from a branch. Something or someone had been there, watching me, waiting. I didn't waste another second. I got in my car and drove, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel. I didn't stop, didn't look back, didn't breathe until I was miles away. I never told Mark what happened. I never asked about the cabin or who else had stayed there. I didn't want to know. I just knew I would never go back. I drove up the winding dirt road, my tires crunching against the gravel, sending up little clouds of dust in my wake. The sky had turned a dull gray by the time I reached the cabin, the last bit of sun swallowed by thick clouds that threatened rain. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel and listening to the quiet. It was my uncle's place, an old log cabin tucked deep into the woods, far from the nearest town. He had died a few months back, and since I was the closest thing to family he had left, the property became mine. I hadn't been here since I was a kid, but I remembered the long weekends spent fishing in the lake, chopping firewood, and listening to my uncle's stories about the old days. Now, I was here to clear the place out, see what was worth keeping, and decide whether I wanted to sell it or keep it as a getaway spot. I stepped out of the truck, stretching my legs. The air was colder than I expected, and a sharp wind blew through the trees, making the branches sway and creak. The cabin stood in front of me, just as I remembered it, small, weathered, with a sagging front porch and a tin roof rusted along the edges. I walked up the steps, the wood groaning under my weight, and unlocked the door. The hinges squealed as I pushed it open, revealing the dark interior. The smell hit me first: stale air, dust, and something else, something faintly sour. I wrinkled my nose and stepped inside, my boots thudding against the worn wooden floor. The place hadn't changed much. A stone fireplace took up one side of the room, a small kitchen sat at the back, and a wooden table with 2 chairs stood in the middle. A single hallway led to the bedroom and the small bathroom. Everything was coated in a fine layer of dust. I dropped my duffel bag by the door and walked through the cabin, opening windows to let in some fresh air. The trees outside swayed, their branches scraping against the roof. I ignored the uneasy feeling in my chest and went back to my truck to grab supplies. The first few hours passed quickly. I swept the floor, wiped down the counters, and gathered up old clothes and blankets to take to a donation center. As I worked, the wind outside picked up, making the trees groan and the cabin walls creak. I kept glancing toward the windows, half expecting to see something moving between the trees, but there was nothing, just the dense forest stretching in every direction. By the time I finished sorting through my uncle's belongings, night had fallen. The cabin was colder now, the air thick with the smell of old wood and damp fabric. I built a fire in the hearth, the crackling flames casting long shadows along the walls. I made myself a quick dinner, canned soup heated over the stove, and sat at the table eating in silence. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes, but inside, it was quiet, too quiet. I told myself I was just tired, that I wasn't used to being alone in a place this isolated. But as I finished my meal, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I locked the doors, checked the windows, and turned off the lights before heading to bed. The bedroom was small, with a single wooden dresser and a bed covered in an old quilt. I changed into sweatpants and a hoodie, climbed under the covers, and shut my eyes. I don't know how long I slept before I woke up. Something had pulled me from sleep. A noise, faint but distinct. I lay still, listening. The fire had died down, leaving the room in near darkness. The only light came from the moon shining through the thin curtains. Then I heard it again, a soft creak, like a floorboard shifting under weight. My breath caught in my throat. The cabin was old, sure, but I knew the sounds it made. This wasn't the house settling. This was different. I reached for my phone and checked the time. 2:43 a.m. The air felt thick, heavy, like the weight of something unseen pressing down on me. I sat up slowly, straining my ears. Another sound, this time closer. A dragging noise, low and deliberate. My mind raced. A bear? A coyote? No, the door was locked and no animal would be moving like that. I slid out of bed as quietly as possible, my heart hammering against my ribs. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand, clicked it on, and pointed it toward the hallway. Nothing. The cabin was still, the only movement coming from the faint flicker of dying embers in the fireplace. But the feeling of being watched was suffocating. I took slow steps toward the door, gripping the flashlight tightly. The floor creaked beneath my weight, loud in the silence. I reached the hallway and aimed the beam down its length. Empty. I swallowed hard and stepped forward. The air smelled different now, stronger, metallic. The sour scent I had noticed earlier was heavier, almost like blood. I turned toward the front door, checking the lock. Still bolted. I stepped into the living room, scanning the space. My duffel bag sat untouched by the door. The chairs were still in place, and yet the kitchen drawer was open. My stomach dropped. I knew I hadn't left it like that. I stepped closer, my pulse pounding in my ears. The drawer was half open, and inside, the knives were scattered, one missing. A single, cold realization hit me. Someone had been inside. I turned sharply, my flashlight beam darting around the room. The air felt electric, every hair on my body standing on end. I grabbed the heaviest knife left in the drawer and backed toward the front door, my breaths coming in short, shaky gasps. I reached for the doorknob, but a sound stopped me cold. A soft exhale, close, too close. I spun around, the flashlight trembling in my grip. For a split second, I saw something in the hallway. A shadow, a shape, the faintest glimpse of movement before the light flickered and died. My hand found the door handle, wrenched it open, and I stumbled onto the porch, gulping in the freezing night air. I turned back, half expecting someone to lunge at me, but the doorway was empty. The cabin stood silent, the darkness inside swallowing everything. I didn't go back in. I grabbed my truck keys from my pocket, jumped into the driver's seat, and started the engine with shaking hands. The headlights flooded the porch, but there was nothing there. I didn't wait. I threw the truck into reverse, my tires spitting gravel as I backed down the dirt road. I didn't stop driving until I reached town, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. The next morning, I called the sheriff. They sent a deputy to check the cabin, but they found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, no missing knives. Just an empty cabin with an open kitchen drawer. I sold the place a week later. I don't know who or what was in there with me that night, and I don't want to know. I only know one thing. I'm never going back. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine as I steered my truck down the narrow, winding road leading deeper into the woods. The further I drove, the less the road looked like something meant for cars. Potholes the size of bathtubs, roots breaking through the dirt, and deep ruts from years of heavy rain had turned the trail into something barely passable. I was heading to an old hunting cabin my uncle left me when he passed last year. I hadn't been there since I was a kid, but I remembered it well enough. At least I thought I did. It was meant to be a quiet weekend, a break from everything. Life had been pulling me in too many directions lately, and I needed some time alone. No phone service, no distractions, just me and the silence of the woods. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, I let out a slow breath. It looked just as I remembered, small, weathered, and barely standing. The wooden siding had turned gray with age, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle. The porch steps creaked under my weight as I carried my bag inside. Inside, the air was stale. Dust covered every surface, and a faint, musty smell lingered in the corners. The single-room cabin had a small wood stove in the center, a rusty old sink along one wall, and a cot pushed up against the far corner. The only window was small and cracked, letting in just enough light to see by. I set my bag down, took a deep breath, and got to work making the place livable for the next few days. I spent the afternoon chopping wood, clearing out a few mouse nests and sweeping away the worst of the dirt. As the sun started setting, I built a fire in the stove, letting the heat chase away the chill. Sitting on the rickety old chair near the fire, I let myself finally relax. The quiet was nice, peaceful. Then I heard it, a sound just outside the cabin. A low, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled through the dirt. I sat up, my body instantly tense. The fire popped, and for a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined it. Then it came again, closer. I stood slowly, straining my ears. My heartbeat pounded against my ribs as I moved toward the window, but the glass was too grimy to see clearly. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped onto the porch, the old wood groaning under my weight. I swept the beam of light over the clearing in front of the cabin. Nothing, just trees and shadows. The sound was gone. I swallowed hard and forced a laugh. Probably just a deer, I told myself. Maybe a branch falling. The woods made noise, it was normal. But still, I double-checked the door's lock before heading to bed. Sleep didn't come easy. Every small noise outside had my eyes snapping open. The wind moving through the trees, the occasional creak of the cabin settling. It all felt louder, sharper. But eventually, exhaustion won out and I drifted off. A loud thump yanked me out of sleep. I shot up in bed, heart racing. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Another thump, then another, from just outside the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly moved toward the door. The lock was still in place, but the wood looked wrong, like something had scraped against it. Deep, uneven grooves ran down the length of it, as if something had been dragged across the surface. I stepped back, breathing heavily. The dragging sound, the thumping, it wasn't just my imagination. For the next hour, I sat in the chair by the fire, gripping my flashlight like a weapon. The noises didn't come back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, watching. The next morning, I stepped outside with a deep sense of unease. The air was cold and damp, the morning fog clinging to the trees like a thick blanket. I walked around the cabin, scanning the ground for any sign of what had made the noise last night. Then I saw them. Tracks. They weren't animal tracks. They weren't boot prints. They were deep, wide, and uneven, like something heavy had been dragged through the dirt. The trail led from the trees to the cabin's porch, and then back into the woods. A chill crawled up my spine. My first thought was that maybe some animal had found a carcass and dragged it through the area. But the tracks were strange, too deep, too controlled. Like whatever made them had a purpose. I spent the rest of the day on edge. The woods no longer felt peaceful. Every snapped twig, every rustling leaf had me turning my head. I told myself I was being paranoid. That night, I locked the door, stoked the fire high, and sat with my back against the wall, waiting. Came again. The dragging sound. Slow, deliberate. I didn't move. My breath came in short, shallow bursts as I listened. It stopped just outside the door. I could hear something breathing. Deep, ragged inhalations like it was struggling for air. I grabbed my knife, my fingers tightening around the handle. The breathing continued for what felt like forever. Then, silence. I didn't sleep at all that night. At first light, I made the decision to leave. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to meet it. I packed my things in record time and stepped onto the porch, my eyes scanning the tree line. The tracks were fresh, deeper, and they led to the back of the cabin. I didn't stop to investigate. I climbed into my truck, started the engine, and tore down the dirt road faster than was safe. I didn't slow down until I hit pavement, my hands aching from how tightly I had been gripping the wheel. When I got home, I did some research on the area. There had been stories, old ones, hunters and trappers disappearing in the woods, unmarked graves found miles from any known settlement. The land had history, bad history. I never went back to the cabin. I still own it. The keys sit in a drawer in my kitchen, untouched. Sometimes I think about selling it. Other times I think about burning it down. But mostly I just try to forget. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, a chance to clear my head, get away from everything, work, people, noise, just me and the woods. A friend of a friend had mentioned a small, secluded rental in northern Minnesota, a perfect spot if I wanted total isolation. No cell service, no neighbors for miles, just trees, a lake, and silence. Sounded perfect. The drive took longer than expected. I left later than I should have, and by the time I reached the last stretch of road, a winding dirt path through thick pine forest, the sun was already slipping behind the trees. The cabin itself was nothing special. A small, one-story structure with a slanted roof, weathered wooden walls, and a narrow porch with a single rocking chair. A woodpile leaned against the side, and the only sign of modernity was a rusted metal antenna sticking up from the roof. Inside, it was simple: a fireplace, a small kitchen, a wooden table with 2 chairs, a couch that had seen better days, and a single bedroom with a lumpy mattress. There was a bathroom, but no running water. The place ran on a generator which sat in a shed out back. I had brought enough food and water for the weekend, a flashlight, a hunting knife, and my old bolt-action rifle. I wasn't expecting trouble, but being deep in the woods, I wasn't going to take chances. The first night was fine. I made a small fire, ate a can of chili, and read by lantern light. The quiet was a little unsettling at first, but after a while, it became comforting. I slept well, lulled by the distant hoots of owls and the rustling of leaves outside. The next morning, I woke early, made coffee on the small propane stove, and stepped outside. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, thick with towering pines and underbrush. A narrow trail led down toward the lake, barely visible through the trees. I spent the day hiking, fishing, and just enjoying the solitude. Everything changed that night. I had just finished eating when I heard it. A sound outside, near the tree line. A crunch like a boot on dry leaves. I froze. It was probably an animal. A deer, maybe, but something about it felt off. Too deliberate, too slow. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the trees. Nothing, just darkness between the trunks. I told myself it was nothing, locked the door, and went to bed, but I couldn't sleep. Every creak, every gust of wind made my skin crawl. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard it again. Closer this time, right outside. A faint, deliberate scrape against the wooden wall. I held my breath. The sound stopped. I stayed like that for what felt like an hour, heart pounding, listening. Nothing. Eventually, I must have dozed off because I woke up to the gray light of dawn filtering through the curtains. I stepped outside, my boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. Everything looked normal, no tracks, no signs that anyone had been there. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I spent the day trying to ignore it. I hiked, gathered wood, tried to enjoy the peace I had come here for. But the feeling lingered, a weight on my chest. That night, I locked the door, checked my rifle, and kept the lantern burning. Around midnight, the noises started again. Footsteps, slow, heavy, moving around the cabin. Then a soft tap, like fingers against the glass. I gripped my rifle, my hands slick with sweat. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The tapping stopped. Then a long silence. Then footsteps again, moving away this time, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep. When dawn finally came, I packed my things. I was done. I had planned to stay until Sunday, but I wasn't spending another night here. As I loaded my bag into the truck, I noticed something, just at the edge of the woods. A figure, not an animal, a man, tall, dressed in dark clothing, standing just beyond the tree line, watching me. I didn't wait. I got in the truck, started the engine, and tore down that dirt road as fast as I could, not looking back. Not until I was miles away, back on paved roads, back in cell service range, back in reality. I never reported it. What would I have said? That someone stood in the woods watching me? That someone tapped on my window in the middle of the night? No crime had been committed. Nothing had happened. But I'll never go back, and I'll never be alone in the woods again. I drove up the winding road, gripping the steering wheel tighter than I needed to. The rental cabin was deep in the woods, at least 30 minutes from the nearest town. My boss had suggested this trip, said I needed a break. I didn't argue. Life had been exhausting lately. Too many late nights, too much coffee, not enough sleep. My head felt like a stretched out rubber band. The solitude would be good for me, I figured. The deeper I went into the forest, the fewer signs of life I saw. No other cabins, no hikers, not even a parked car. Just trees, thick and unrelenting, pressing in on either side of the road. My GPS lost service about 10 miles back, but I wasn't worried. I had printed out the directions before I left. By the time I reached the cabin, it was nearly dusk. The structure was smaller than I expected, but it looked sturdy. A simple one-story log cabin with a steep roof, nestled between towering pines. A single porch light glowed weakly, flickering slightly as I pulled my car into the gravel driveway. I got out and stretched, inhaling the sharp scent of pine needles and damp earth. The place was quiet, too quiet. I had grown used to the hum of the city, the distant sirens, the murmur of voices at all hours. Out here, there was only the sound of wind through the trees and the occasional creak of branches swaying against each other. The cabin door was unlocked, just as the rental company had promised. Inside, it smelled like old wood and dust. The air was slightly stale, as if no one had been here in weeks. The furniture was simple. A couch, a wooden table, a single armchair. The kitchen was small but functional. A hallway led to the bedroom and bathroom. Everything seemed fine. I set my bag down in the bedroom, noticing how cold it was inside. The old radiator in the corner looked unreliable, but there was a fireplace in the living room. I decided I'd get a fire going after I unpacked. As night fell, the cabin seemed to shrink around me. The darkness outside was absolute. There were no streetlights, no distant glow of a neighbor's window, just the cabin, alone in a sea of black. The wind picked up, rattling the windows. I added more logs to the fire and sat on the couch, flipping through an old book I had brought. The crackling flames were the only sound. At some point, I must have dozed off. I woke up suddenly. A sharp noise had pulled me from sleep. I sat up, listening. At first, I heard nothing but the wind. Then there it was again, a faint crunching sound, like footsteps on gravel. I held my breath. Could have been an animal, a deer maybe, but the sound was too steady, too deliberate. I stood up slowly and moved toward the window. The porch light was still on, casting a pale glow over the front yard. Nothing. I exhaled, feeling ridiculous. Just the wind, maybe a falling branch. I turned away from the window and froze. The front door was unlocked. I was sure I had locked it when I came in. Positive. My stomach tightened. Maybe I had forgotten. Maybe I had been too tired to notice. I locked it again, double-checking this time. Then I went back to the couch, but I didn't sit. I stood there for a long moment, listening. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself I was overreacting. I turned off the lights, leaving only the fire burning low, and went to bed. The bed was stiff, the blanket scratchy, but exhaustion won over discomfort. I don't know how long I slept before I woke up again. The noise was closer this time, not outside, inside. A soft creak, like weight shifting on the wooden floor. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't move. I listened, my pulse pounding in my ears. Another creak, closer. Someone was in the cabin. I reached for my phone. No service. I swallowed hard and slid out of bed as quietly as possible. My feet barely touched the floor as I crept toward the door. The only sound was my own shallow breathing. The bedroom door was slightly open. I was sure I had closed it before bed. I nudged it open an inch more, peering into the hallway. The glow from the dying fire flickered against the walls. The living room looked empty. Then I saw it. The front door was open, wide open. The cold night air seeped in, making the fire hiss and sputter. I stepped back, heart hammering. My bag was still in the bedroom, my car keys inside. I would have to run for it. Taking a deep breath, I moved, fast, out of the bedroom, through the hallway, past the empty couch. I barely glanced outside as I grabbed my keys from my bag. Then I heard the sound. Footsteps, rushing toward the porch. I didn't look. I bolted. Out the door, across the yard, gravel crunching under my feet. The car was locked. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys. Behind me, the footsteps stopped. I yanked the car door open and threw myself inside, locking it instantly. My breath came in ragged gasps as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine sputtered. No. Caught. The headlights flared to life, illuminating the trees. Something moved at the edge of the woods, a shadow slipping back into the darkness. Too fast for me to see clearly. I didn't wait. I threw the car into reverse, tires skidding on the gravel. Then I was on the road, speeding away from the cabin, not daring to look back. I drove straight through the night, not stopping until I reached the town. At a gas station, I parked under the bright lights and sat there, hands gripping the wheel, trying to steady my breathing. Eventually, I called the rental company, told them something had happened, that I was leaving early. I didn't give details. I didn't want to think about it. I never went back, never tried to figure out what or who I had heard that night. I didn't want to know. I don't know why I thought it would be a good idea to stay alone in a cabin deep in the woods. Maybe I just wanted peace and quiet. Maybe I wanted to prove something to myself. Either way, I wish I had never gone. The cabin wasn't anything special. It was an old structure, probably built in the 70s or earlier. The walls were rough wood, the floors creaked with every step, and the smell of damp would never really went away. There was a fireplace, a small kitchen, and one bedroom. No electricity, no running water, just a propane stove, some old furniture, and a lantern hanging from a hook in the ceiling. The windows were dirty, the glass wavy from age. The trees outside were thick, surrounding the place like a wall. I arrived in the late afternoon. The sky was dull gray, and the wind had a sharp bite to it. I parked my truck near the porch, making sure it was close enough in case I needed to leave in a hurry. The nearest road was over a mile away, just a narrow dirt path through the woods. I felt uneasy the moment I stepped out of the truck, but I shook it off as nerves. I had never been completely alone in a place like this before. The first night was quiet, almost too quiet. I sat by the fireplace, listening to the wood crackle. Outside, the wind picked up, making the trees groan. I ate a quick meal from a can, then settled into the old bed, pulling a thick blanket over myself. The mattress was lumpy, the sheets smelled dusty, but I was exhausted. I fell asleep fast. A sound woke me up in the middle of the night. First, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again. Something moving outside. Slow, deliberate steps on the porch. I held my breath, listening. The lantern beside the bed gave off a dim, flickering light. The sound stopped. Then, a soft creak, like weight shifting on old wood. I reached for the hunting knife I had brought with me. My heart was pounding. I thought about getting up, checking the window, but I was too afraid to move. I just lay there, gripping the knife, waiting. Nothing happened. After what felt like an hour, I finally convinced myself it was just my imagination. Maybe an animal had wandered onto the porch. Maybe the cabin was settling. I stayed awake for a long time, listening, but eventually, exhaustion won. I drifted off into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside to check the porch. The air was cold and damp. The wood was slick with moisture. I looked around, scanning the trees, but saw nothing unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there. I spent the day trying to keep myself busy. I chopped some wood, gathered water from a nearby stream, and cooked a simple meal. But the uneasiness never left. Every time I looked up, I felt like I was being watched. The trees were too still. The air was too heavy. That night, I locked the cabin door and wedged a chair under the handle. It wasn't much, but it made me feel a little safer. I sat by the fire again, staring into the flames. The wind had died down, leaving the woods eerily silent. Then, just as I was about to turn in, I heard it again. This time it was closer. A faint rustling, then a soft scrape against the outside wall. I swallowed hard, gripping my knife. My body was tense, every muscle coiled like a spring. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon, maybe a deer brushing against the wood. But then I heard breathing, low, steady, just on the other side of the wall. I stopped breathing myself. My grip on the knife tightened until my knuckles ached. The sound lasted for what felt like forever, then slowly faded away. I didn't move. I didn't dare. Eventually, the fire burned low, and the only light came from the faint glow of the lantern. I stayed awake, listening. Every sound made my skin crawl. The creak of the cabin settling, the occasional rustle of leaves outside. I was too afraid to sleep. At some point, exhaustion won again. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, the sun was rising, and the cabin was filled with cold, pale light. My body ached from tension, but I was alive. I stepped outside, scanning the tree line. Nothing. No footprints, no signs of anything unusual. But I knew what I had heard. I wasn't imagining it. I lasted one more night in that cabin. The final night, I barely slept at all. The sounds came back closer this time. Slow, steady movements outside. I heard soft scraping against the window. I didn't look, couldn't. The breathing returned, just on the other side of the door. Then, just before dawn, something tapped against the wood. Not a knock, not an animal scratching, just a slow, deliberate tap. Tap, tap, tap. I stayed frozen in my bed until the first light of morning crept through the window. Then, without hesitation, I grabbed my bag, my knife, and my keys. I didn't even bother making breakfast. I threw everything in the truck and started the engine, my hands shaking. As I pulled away, I glanced at the cabin one last time. The door was still closed. The porch was empty. The trees stood still. There was nothing there, but I knew better. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Who would believe me? There were no ghosts, no monsters, no logical explanation. Just a cabin, deep in the woods, and something that didn't want me there. I had no good reason to rent that cabin. It was too far from town, too deep in the woods, and too damn quiet. But I needed time alone, and the price was good. That's how it always starts, right? Something is too good, too easy. I should have known better. The drive out was long, the kind that makes you regret going anywhere at all. It was mid-October, and the trees were half bare, their fallen leaves turning the road into a slick orange mess. The gravel driveway leading to the cabin was just wide enough for my truck, the tires crunching over loose stone. When I killed the engine, the silence pressed in. No wind, no birds, just that heavy, wooded quiet. The cabin was smaller than I expected. A single-story thing with dark wood, a tin roof, and a wraparound porch. There was a shed out back, the kind that looks like it hasn't been opened in years. I noticed an old axe leaning against the cabin's side, the handle darkened from years of weather. Something about it made me uneasy, but I ignored it and carried my bags inside. The interior was simple. A kitchen with an old gas stove, a fridge humming louder than it should, and a table covered in dust. The living room had one of those sagging couches that you just know smells like mildew, a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years, and a single window looking out into the trees. The bedroom was just a bed and a nightstand. No decorations, no pictures, just bare wood and dust. I settled in fast, unpacking my bags and cracking open a beer. I had no real plans, just a few books, some old movies on my laptop, and a need to be away from people. Felt good at first, peaceful, but as the sun set, the feeling changed. The first thing I noticed was the cold. It settled in fast, unnatural for October, and the old space heater I brought barely did a thing. I threw on a jacket and checked the windows, making sure they were closed. That's when I noticed something off. The window above the sink had smudges on it, long streaks in the dust like someone had run their fingers down the glass. I wiped at them, thinking it was just grime, but the streaks stayed. The marks were on the outside. I shook it off and went to bed early, but sleep didn't come easy. The silence was too thick, pressing in like a weight. Every little creak of the cabin felt louder in the dark. I must have dozed off at some point, but something woke me up just past 3 a.m. A sound, distant but distinct. A single sharp crack, like a branch breaking underfoot. I lay still, heart hammering, listening. Nothing came after it, just the wind picking up outside, rattling the trees. Could have been anything. A deer, maybe. Falling limb. I forced myself to roll over and close my eyes. Then it happened again. Closer. This time it wasn't a snap. It was a slow, dragging sound. Something moving through the leaves. Not an animal. Not the wind. I stayed still, listening so hard my ears rang. It stopped just outside the cabin. I pictured the old axe leaning against the wall outside. I should have brought it in. My body screamed at me to move, to check, to do something, but I didn't. I lay there, frozen, waiting. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the sound stopped. I don't know how long I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening for something that never came. Eventually, exhaustion won. When I woke up, the sun was already high. The fear from the night before felt stupid in the daylight. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Not boot prints, not shoe prints. Bare feet, pressed deep into the dirt, circling the cabin. The leaves were disturbed in long drags, like something had shuffled through them. My stomach twisted as I followed the tracks. They didn't lead to the road. They didn't lead anywhere. They just stopped, like whoever or whatever made them had just disappeared. I went back inside, locked the door, and spent the rest of the day convincing myself it was nothing. Maybe some drifter passing through. Maybe just a trick of my tired mind. I almost believed it. Almost. That night, I pushed the couch in front of the door and kept the axe next to my bed. I didn't sleep much. Every creak of the cabin made my skin crawl. But nothing happened. No footsteps, no sounds. Just that unbearable silence. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed my bags, locked the cabin behind me, and threw everything in the truck. As I turned the key in the ignition, I glanced up at the window. The streaks on the glass were back. Fresh ones. 5 long smudges, pressed hard against the outside of the glass. Right where my face had been the night before. I didn't stick around to clean them this time. I drove out fast, the gravel spitting under my tires, refusing to look in the rearview mirror. I didn't stop until I hit the highway, until the cabin was miles behind me. I never went back. I never told the owner why. I didn't care. Whatever was out there in those woods, it wasn't human, and I wasn't about to wait around to find out what it wanted. I don't know why I agreed to stay in that cabin. Maybe I wanted some time alone, away from everything. Maybe I thought being out in the woods for a weekend would clear my head. But now, looking back, I know it was a mistake. A big one. The drive out there was quiet. The roads got smaller, winding through thick woods. My GPS lost signal about halfway in, and I had to rely on written directions. The cabin was deep in the forest, far from any main roads. By the time I arrived, the sun was already setting, and a thick fog was rolling in. The place was small, older-looking, with dark wooden walls and a slanted roof. The porch creaked under my weight as I stepped onto it. The key was right where the owner said it would be, under a loose rock by the door. Inside, the cabin smelled like damp wood and dust. The furniture was old, mismatched, probably brought in over the years from different places. The living room had a stone fireplace, a couch that looked like it hadn't been used in a while, and a single lamp in the corner. The kitchen was small, just a sink, a fridge, and a few cabinets. I put my bag down, double-checked my phone, no signal. I wasn't surprised. The owner had warned me about that. I spent the first hour unpacking and setting up. I'd brought enough food for the weekend, a flashlight, a knife, just in case, and a book I'd been meaning to read. The silence out here was thick. No distant traffic, no voices, just the occasional rustling of trees in the wind. I liked it at first. That night, I built a fire in the fireplace and made a simple dinner. Sitting there, eating in the dim light, I started to feel something. Not fear, not yet, but unease. The kind that creeps in slowly, like your brain is picking up on something your eyes haven't caught yet. I brushed it off, finished eating, and went to bed. The bedroom was small, just a bed and a nightstand. The sheets smelled a little musty, but I didn't care. I was tired. The forest outside was dead quiet. No birds, no insects. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the absence of sound. Took me a long time to fall asleep. I woke up to something. A noise. A single thud, like something heavy dropping onto the floor. My heart was pounding immediately. I sat up, listening. Nothing. Just silence. I told myself it was the house settling or maybe something falling off a shelf. But when I got up and checked, nothing was out of place. I went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The feeling of unease was stronger now. Something about the air felt wrong, heavier. I forced myself to close my eyes. The next morning, everything felt normal again. I shook off the weird feeling, made some coffee, and stepped outside. The forest was still foggy, the air cold. I walked around the cabin, looking at the trees, the moss-covered rocks. There were no trails, just thick woods in every direction. It felt isolated, cut off, peaceful in a way. By afternoon, I decided to go for a short walk. I kept track of where I was, marking trees with my pocket knife to make sure I wouldn't get lost. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No birds, no wind, just my own breathing and the crunch of leaves under my boots. That feeling from last night crept back. A sense that I wasn't supposed to be here. Then I saw something that made my stomach turn. A clearing, empty except for a small wooden structure. Not a cabin, not a shed, more like a crude, hand-built box made of rotting wood. The door was slightly open. I don't know why, but I stepped closer. The smell hit me before I even looked inside. Something foul, rotting. I peeked in and saw what looked like animal bones piled in the corner. The walls were covered in deep scratches. Some of them looked old, some fresh. I turned around and walked back the way I came, faster this time. I kept my eyes on the trees, on the marks I'd made, making sure I wasn't going in circles. I felt watched, like something was just beyond my vision, keeping pace with me. By the time I reached the cabin, I was sweating. I locked the door behind me and sat down, trying to calm my breathing. My hands were shaking. Maybe it was just an old hunting shelter. Maybe the bones were from a deer or some other animal. But those scratches on the walls, that night the silence felt different, heavier, like the world outside the cabin wasn't just empty, but waiting. I kept my knife close and barely slept. At some point, I heard something outside. Not footsteps, something dragging, slow and deliberate. I held my breath. The sound moved around the cabin, pausing near the front door, then the window. I didn't move, couldn't. I don't know how long I lay there, but eventually, the sound stopped. The night stretched on, endless. Morning came, pale and cold. I packed my things as fast as I could. I didn't care about breakfast, didn't care about anything except leaving. The feeling of being watched never left me. I stepped outside, locking the door behind me, and froze. There were marks in the dirt. Not footprints, drag marks like something heavy had been pulled through the soil. They led from the woods to my cabin door. My stomach turned. I didn't look back. I got in my car and drove, faster than I should have, my hands gripping the wheel so hard they hurt. The further I got from that place, the lighter the air felt, like I had been holding my breath for 2 days without realizing it. I don't know what I heard, what I felt out there. I don't know who or what made those marks, built that wooden box in the woods. But I know one thing, I'm never going back. I don't know why I agreed to go up there alone. Maybe I wanted to prove something to myself. Maybe I thought I needed space from everything back home. But now, sitting in this freezing cabin with only a weak flashlight and the sound of the wind pressing against the walls, I regret every decision that led me here. The drive up had been fine, mostly. A long stretch of cracked 2-lane roads, A few gas stations where the attendants barely looked up, and then miles of gravel leading into thick woods. The last 20 minutes were the worst. Potholes, trees scraping the side of my truck, and the sense that if anything happened, no one would be around to help. I had rented the cabin from an old listing I found online. Cheap, secluded, and perfect for a weekend of relaxation. I don't know what I expected, but when I finally pulled up, I felt something tighten in my chest. The place looked abandoned. The wooden steps sagged, the windows were covered in grime, and the door had deep scratches as if someone or something had tried to claw its way inside. I hesitated before going in. There was no cell service, and I had no way to check in with anyone. But I had driven for hours, packed enough supplies, and told myself that turning back now would be stupid. So I went inside. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Damp wood, mildew, and something else. Something faint but sour. The walls were covered in dust, and the furniture looked like it hadn't been touched in years. There were no personal items, no decorations, just the bare minimum. A couch, a table, a small kitchen, and a bedroom in the back. The fireplace was filled with ash, but there was a stack of wood by the door. I lit a fire, hoping the warmth would make the place feel less wrong. Didn't. I spent the first few hours unpacking, trying to ignore the growing unease in my gut. The silence was thick, pressing down on me. Every creak of the wood made me jump. I told myself it was just the cabin settling, just the wind, just my imagination. But as night fell, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The first night, I barely slept. The noises started around midnight. At first, they were faint, just the wind, I told myself. But then they became sharper, more deliberate. A soft tapping on the walls, the sound of leaves crunching outside. I held my breath, listening. Could have been an animal, a deer, a raccoon, something harmless. Then the tapping moved to the window. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. My flashlight was on the table across the room. I didn't want to move, didn't want to look, but I forced myself to grab it, my fingers trembling as I clicked it on and shined it toward the window. Nothing, just darkness and the reflection of my own wide eyes. I barely slept, every noise jolting me awake. When morning finally came, I told myself I was being paranoid. I had driven all this way for peace, and I wasn't going to let a few weird noises ruin that. I forced myself to go outside, to walk around the cabin, to prove to myself that I was overreacting. That's when I saw the footprints. They circled the cabin. Deep impressions in the dirt, leading from the trees, stopping at the windows, and disappearing back into the woods. Not animal tracks, not boots either, bare feet, human. I swallowed hard, scanning the treeline. No movement, no signs of anyone, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I told myself they were old tracks, maybe from the last person who stayed here, but I didn't believe it. I spent the day trying to distract myself, chopping wood, reading, keeping the fire going. As the sun started to set, I checked my truck, making sure it would start if I needed to leave in a hurry. The engine turned over fine, but when I reached for my phone, I realized I had left it inside. I went back to the cabin, and as I opened the door, I froze. The fire had been put out, not burned down, put out. The logs were still there, damp and smoldering. My stomach dropped. I hadn't left the cabin. No one else was here. At least I thought no one was. I locked the door, checked the windows, and grabbed the hatchet I had brought for chopping wood. I told myself I was being stupid, but I kept it next to me anyway. As night fell, the noises started again. Louder this time. Footsteps on the porch. The doorknob rattling. A soft scratching against the wood. I held my breath, gripping the hatchet so tight my knuckles turned white. Hours passed like that, every sound making my pulse hammer in my ears. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I must have dozed off because when I opened my eyes, the room was darker than before. The fire was out again, and the door was unlocked. I bolted upright, my breath catching in my throat. I knew I had locked it. I knew I had. My hands shook as I reached for the flashlight, scanning the room. Everything looked the same. Nothing was missing. Nothing was out of place, but someone had been inside. I didn't waste time. I grabbed my bag, my keys, and ran to my truck. I didn't look back, didn't check the cabin one last time. I just started the engine and drove, my hands shaking so bad I could barely keep the wheel straight. I drove for miles, not stopping until I saw the lights of a gas station. I parked, locked the doors, and sat there, trying to catch my breath. My phone had a signal now. I checked the listing, scrolling through the old photos, trying to find some clue that I had missed before. Then I saw it. In one of the photos, barely visible in the reflection of the cabin's window, was a figure, person, standing just inside the tree line, watching. I never went back to get my deposit, never reported it. I didn't want to know who had been out there, or worse, who had been inside. I just drove home, knowing I'd never be alone in the woods again.